see my slides?
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, forgot I've got animations on this. Yeah, so I've shortened the title down a little bit because that one was extremely long. So this presentation, yeah, is just about how can we use data and how can we use kind of assessment methods to help us make use of the best use of what we already have in the built environment. You know, that's a pretty key aspect of circular economy. So yeah, what role did audits and data have? Yeah, audits makes it sound really boring, like sort of accountancy or something. No offense to any accountants. And yeah, it can be quite boring, to be honest with you. It is my sort of day-to-day job, but I think it is, you know, really useful as well. And it sort of just comes down to measuring and therefore being able to manage. So yeah, that's what I'm going to talk about today. If my slides move. There we go. Really quick one about Reusefully. So we're just a group of 8 or so colleagues who have been working together for a while in the built environment. A few of us, Catherine, Gilly, myself and Simon, met back when we were at BRE. So we're getting involved in projects like BAMB and Circuit, so which kind of has naturally led us on to what we're doing now. And yeah, we do a bit of everything, a lot of pre-demolition audits, pre-redevelopment audits, but also, you know, kind of bespoke consultancy, do quite a few research and development projects still. So that's us. I'm not going to dwell on this bit too much because I'm sure everyone's sick of having circular economy explained to them 50 million times, but just as a really sort of basic context for this presentation, I mean, you can sum it all up really, I think, in doing more with less. So achieving the kind of social, economic, environmental outcomes that we want, that we need, without using as much resource, without generating as much emissions and other, you know, negative environmental, social impacts. So that's it in a nutshell. I won't go into it more than that. I think the other thing to mention is that it is a really systemic, you know, attribute of a system or of an economy. It needs change by actors really throughout the system to happen. There's a lot of, or there has been a lot of talk about it. I think we're now getting more into the detail, into the action of it. There's, you know, actual case studies and there's actual, you know, people doing things rather than talking about it. So that's good. Obviously, we need to go further than that. And I think importantly, it is achievable as well. There's success stories, you know, coming out quite regularly at the moment. Like I say, we're still a long way off, but things that we imagined were quite hard to do, you know, a few years ago are now just becoming, well, appearing very doable. So yeah, going back to the making the most of what we have, or yeah, making use of existing resources, there's kind of 2 ways we can think about this, which relate to different aspects of the built environment. So firstly, there's the existing buildings and the space and the function and the performance that they deliver. And then there's also the materials and the components within those existing buildings that eventually come to their end of life in the existing buildings. So if we want to make the best of the existing built environment, we need to kind of target these 2 areas really. So space and functionality and materials and components. And in practice, that translates to keeping existing buildings standing if, you know, if they can actually continue to deliver what we need them to deliver, and if they can perform right, and if you know, there's the overall cost benefit. I don't mean that necessarily financially, I mean that in terms of all sustainability aspects is positive. And then where that isn't the case, recovering anything that does emerge at end of life, any components and any materials. And that can be at demolition, but it can be at any point, I think, in the life cycle of a building component. So it can be whilst it's, you know, if it's replaced during repairs and maintenance, or during building refurbishment or retrofit. There's no need to just limit this to pre-demolition to demolition projects. So with that in mind, I think probably everyone has heard the kind of mantra of, I'm gonna have to remember it now, you can't manage what you don't measure, or something along those, there's various iterations of that. But if we want to make the most of our existing built environment, if we want to keep buildings that can be retained up, and if we want to avoid components and materials being wasted, then we kind of have to measure them. We have to assess them. So there's two ways that we do this at the moment. So the first of these is the pre-redevelopment audit. That's looking at existing buildings. Can we retain them? And then there's the pre-demolition audit, which we're now talking more about just general material audits rather than pre-demolition audits for the reasons I mentioned before. In terms of policy on this, a lot of this has been driven lately by the circular economy statements that are required under the London Plan by the GLA. So these require a whole assessment of a proposed project, including the new build, if there's anything proposed or any works proposed, so materials going into that and coming out of that. But it does require that for any sites where there's existing buildings, a pre-redevelopment audit has to be done and a pre-demolition audit has to be done. So that's really driven a lot lately. And we are seeing a lot in London, but there are some elsewhere as well, increasingly. This has been required under BREEAM for quite a few years now. So any projects that have been pursuing BREEAM will have had to do a pre-demolition audit under the waste, I think it's waste 1 criteria. And interestingly, we're seeing quite a few developers and asset owners now putting in requirements for these kind of assessments. British Land springs to mind, Royal London Asset Management, and there's a few others as well that are either directly requiring these audits or that are requiring BREEAM Excellent, which means you have to do a pre-demolition audit and so on. So they are kind of, it seems the numbers of these are ballooning lately, which means we're very busy. So just to quickly put in context, this flow chart here is taken from the circular economy statement guidance from the GLA. And as well, I've added in these green bubbles here, but it's essentially just a representation of what to do with an existing building, how the decision-making process works. So, and then where pre-redevelopment audits fit in and where pre-demolition audits fit in. So I won't go into that too much. A little more detail on what a pre-redevelopment audit is. Like I said, it's essentially assessment to see whether this existing building that you have, should we keep it, or is it more favourable to let it be demolished and a new build? A lot of the time, I think we are demolishing buildings that do not need to be demolished. A lot of it happens under the kind of guise of commercial viability, but when you're walking around quite a lot of these buildings, you're thinking this is fine, this is nice. So something definitely needs to change in practice here. But yeah, back to the point. So the kinds of things we're looking at when we're doing a pre-redevelopment audit, it's not just a single, it's not just about the structure. Obviously, that is hugely important. If the building's going to fall down, then you shouldn't really be keeping it. But also you could be thinking of structure in terms of, can it be extended? Can it be expanded horizontally or vertically or even internally, if you're adding mezzanines and that kind of thing. So that's one aspect of it. I think we don't want to be keeping buildings that are negative in some way or that couldn't be retained, that couldn't be refurbished or retrofit to be positive and, both to the occupants and externally. So aspects that we're thinking of there is, what's the quality for the occupants of the building? What kind of impacts does the building have externally as well? This is a tricky one, to be honest with you. It's hard to say what costs and benefits a building has externally, but I think it is important to look at. I think largely at the moment we're using kind of planning policies to define, what should a building be contributing to the local area, but it is a bit open-ended at the moment. There is an aspect of commercial viability, because if a building is going to be unutilized or underutilized, in my opinion, that's the least sustainable building you can have. If it's not being used at all, or it's not sort of meeting its kind of potential in terms of utilization, that means that demand for buildings is displaced somewhere. So somewhere more floor space is being added as a result. So there is an aspect of commercial viability which is important. And it's just figuring out how much of that is desired commercial viability and how much is real. And then there's the practical feasibility as well. Does the site and the building actually enable retention? So if you're looking at refurbishment or retrofit, is it possible to do that, or expansion? As you could probably imagine, this requires quite a few inputs from lots of different disciplines. So part of it is about bringing together information from all these different sources. At the moment, I don't think they are detailed enough. So, we'd really like to be doing full post-occupancy evaluations or building performance evaluations. At the moment, it's kind of using rules of thumb, but I think that's the direction for future. And then the other aspect of whether an existing building should be retained or not is how does that scenario relate to a new build scenario, to a demolition and new build scenario? As a kind of, example here, if you had a building that was completely dismantleable, everything had mechanical fixings, you could pull it apart completely, everything could then be reused directly, you could just go reassemble the building somewhere else 100%. Then if it was not performing well, or if it wasn't utilized well in its current guise, in its current context, then actually maybe the demolition and new build scenario would be preferable. Obviously that's an extreme example, but there's a scale, there's a balance there to achieve. Honestly, I think a lot of the time at least the environmental impacts favor retention, but we've got to appreciate that there is a balance to be made there. So the output of these pre-redevelopment audits are essentially a report at the moment that is, well, these are the way we do it anyway. I think there's one thing to note is that it is quite unstandardized. There's not really any guidance on how to do this. It's just being asked for. So it's kind of up to whoever's reading it, the planning officer, whether they decide it's good enough. But yeah, essentially it's recommendations on yes, no, should the building be retained, or is there grounds for favouring demolition and new build? And then retention isn't necessarily just yes, no. There are various different ways you can retain a building. So, if it's working well, if it's performing well, if there's no health and safety aspect, then you may just decide that actually the building is doing fine. It's serving a function and it can continue to be used as it is. Another aspect is, or another kind of retention method is just adapting the way you use the building. So not necessarily making any architectural changes, potentially just increasing the use in some way, or possibly change of use, can just make sure that it's being utilized and that it's performing as it should do. Then you get more into the actual physical changes. So you may need to refurbish the building to bring it back up to a good enough standard. I'd also include retrofit in that. So if you need to bring the building to energy performance standards, then that's an option too. And then there's kind of deeper architectural adaptations, so things like extensions or even partial demolition, just to kind of resize the building so that it fits its requirements better. And then if none of those are feasible, then you can start looking at demolition and new build. And I should say that you can do several of these at once. The building is not just one monolithic object. It has various different spaces and zones and elements that you can kind of consider of their own merits. I'll just move on because I'm aware time's moving on. So that's pre-redevelopment audits. The other side is material audits, aka pre-demolition audits. And like I mentioned before, that's just a way to understand in a building that is going to be demolished, or even in an element that's going to be demolished, or even in an in-use asset that is undergoing repairs and maintenance or retrofit. This is an audit to understand what is in there, in what quantities is it in there, and what is the potential for recovering these items at their end of service life. And then there should be some exploration of the actual avenues for doing that. So we're talking about historic buildings, well, not historic buildings, but older buildings a lot of the time. And the level of information on them is really quite poor a lot of the time. So we have to use a number of different information gathering methods to do this. The sort of basic is at least getting the drawings, but we don't always get that. So if you can see the top right image there is I can't even remember exactly what it is, but that's all the information we got for one building. I think it showed the floor layouts of the rooms vertically, and that was it. So a lot of the time we have to draw in information from all kinds of different sources. We'll always go to site and do a site visit. So you can see my colleague Jilly there looking very intently at something. Where we take, we measure things up, we take notes, we take photos, we essentially start to put together a picture of what the building is. Taking drawings, any existing surveys that there are. We'll take any public data as well, can be useful. So planning archives, Google Street View, pretty much anything we can get our hands on. And we then kind of put that all together. A bit of magic happens and we carry out our analysis, which tells us, like I mentioned, we classify the materials and components that are there, describe them in terms of what kind of condition they're in, where are they in the building, attach some photos to them, and then quantify them. Different materials are in different, better to quantify in different units of measurement. Everything we'll do in tons and volume, but then, types of flooring might be better in meters squared, for example. And then for each individual item we find, we'll set targets for the percent that we think can be reused, can be recycled, can be otherwise avoided from landfill. So for instance, energy from waste, and then what the remainder is that has to go to landfill. And then we look at other things like the embodied carbon. If you were to reuse it, what quantity of embodied carbon could be potentially avoided in a new build. And that's the kind of data heavy aspect there. I think the thing that is probably or potentially as useful, if not more, is actually the guidance that you give then, because a lot of the time we say you should reuse this, you should recycle that, but a contractor, client, or whoever isn't necessarily going to know exactly how to do that. It's not really business as usual. So we will go into a bit of detail on actually how to do it, what kind of legal requirements there are, and any organisations that may be able to support those activities. So that's a really quick view of material audits. Couple more slides here. So I think one thing we've realised with these audits is that they are just a snapshot in time. They tend to just, if it's for planning purposes, it depends on the client. Sometimes they'll use it, often they won't. It'll just go sit in a folder that's submitted as part of a planning application. So I think we're leaning more and more towards actually helping to support what happens next. So what do you actually do with all that information? I don't know if you can see my mouse, but yeah, there's this kind of bit up here, like there's a report, here you go, right, we all go our separate ways. But if we want to actually make reuse and recycling and so on happen, there's so many different activities that actually need to be supported there. So conversations with demolition contractors, you know, tender documentation, setting, you know, literally setting up with the supply chain or with the logistics side of things, posting to reuse platforms, all kinds of stuff. So I think now, you know, things are moving this way. We're getting more and more clients that are interested in doing in actually what happens rather than just ticking the box. But yeah, it's there's still quite a bit to go on this. So yeah, just quickly, I think this is my last slide. Some of the lessons we've learned and the issues that we found with these audits. At the moment, they are pretty unstandardized. There's a couple of documents and protocols for pre-demolition audits, but they don't go into a huge amount of detail. There's not much on actual data requirements, how they should be used. So, which does mean that it's a little bit of a Wild West at the moment. I think it's getting a lot better though. Since I, you know, the idea for this presentation came about from a previous one that Feja and I met at last summer, and things have got a lot better since then, I would say. But yeah, still fairly unstandardized. There is a European level standards task group at the moment, which is looking at standardizing these, but they take quite a while to come through. So that's where we are at the moment. I think in the future it will pick up quite fast. The quality can really be quite bad, especially where this is done for a tick box exercise. There's not really any requirement necessarily. Well, partially comes from being unstandardized, but you know, we see some really bad ones. So yeah, there needs to be a bit more oversight there, I think. Yeah, I mentioned the tick box thing. Not necessarily an easy way around that. There will always be, you know, clients who aren't interested, or well, hopefully there won't always be, but at the moment there are, and they will just do these because they have to. I think they're undertaken too late a lot of the time, especially in the case of the pre-redevelopment audits, because you generally, when you come in, you know, come onto a project to do a pre-redevelopment audit, it's because the project is underway. Decisions have been made regarding a site that it needs to be redeveloped, and designs have been drawn up. So you then saying, no, you shouldn't do this, doesn't really go down well. And that kind of feeds into that penultimate bullet point there. Project clients are the ones who commission the assessments at the moment. And that means that as an assessor, you're working for the client. So if you're telling them, no, we don't think you should be demolishing this, we think instead you should be retaining it, when, you know, they will probably get bigger profits if they do demolish it, that doesn't tend to go down well, too well, based on experience. So I think overall something definitely needs change in that system there, because it's a perverse incentive. If you're the kind of auditor that tells, you know, that says no, you shouldn't be doing this, you're not going to get hired very much. So yeah, something needs to change, I think, in the quite near future there. Final point, they're not taken together very often. They should be part of one, you know, one whole assessment, but they are done separately, which means you can't necessarily look at the relative pros and cons that easily. And I'll leave it there. I think I may have gone over a bit. Sorry about that, but thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ben. It is all very interesting. You did go over a bit. I know people, I can't remember what we promised this to be, 45 minutes overall, so it's obviously going to go over, and we understand if people need to get back to some other activity. But meanwhile, I hope you can stay for Feja's part of the presentation. You ready to share?
Well, I don't have any slides, as I
Oh,
said.
okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna go, old style, and you're gonna have to put up with my face. Yeah, so I mean, the focus of this session was to highlight a particular tool, which there's quite a lot of attention on, that its potential to prevent the loss of materials through avoiding demolition and promoting redevelopment. So this is a tool, and obviously there's sort of a lot of attention being paid to this tool. But the reality is that we're talking about wanting to increase the amount of materials that aren't being consumed in the entire sort of material marketplace. So the idea is we need to scale up. And how do we scale up demand for these tools within a system? And we're all very we all understand that the circular economy is presented in a sort of systemic way. So this is a tool within a system. So what is the system? And we're talking about a system within construction. Who are the big players in this system? And a common feature in a lot of law and policy, sort of a lot of the sort of roadmaps, etc., is to flag up the potential for circular public procurement. And I will emphasize that the potential is largely placed in circular public procurement. There's a lot of potential in procurement of businesses, which could also be addressed. But I'm going to talk more about the potential around circular public procurement and supporting measures to enable that. So many cities have dedicated and committed roadmaps and strategies for circular public procurement. We've got London, they incorporated the idea, at least, Amsterdam, Belgium, Brussels, which in moving forward on circular public procurement, mapped out the land availability, so combined procurement with land planning reforms, which clearly is another aspect in terms of moving towards circularity, how you use the material stock, the building stock, and the land stock that you have, because we do need new buildings. You can't not have new buildings as well. So that's very much part of the sort of future planning of government. Now, in terms of procurement, one of the interesting things is the amount of investment that rests with local authorities and decision making by local authorities. So an interesting example, there's a consultancy called Orbis Procurement, which works with Surrey, Essex and Brighton Hove Council to move towards more sustainable procurement, and that they've emphasised that they're trying to move towards circular procurement. And construction's a very big part of their portfolio. Now, one of the major observations from pilot studies on circular procurement is about the obstacles, the difficulties. And those difficulties fit a lot with what Ben's been saying at the sort of coal face, if you can use coal face as a word anymore, or a phrase. There's the technical challenges of actually documenting the materials that are available, whether they can be taken out, the quality of those materials, the quantity of materials, and then placing them on a marketplace. Where do they go? How are they kept? How are they stored? How are they determined that they meet standards in terms of health and safety when they're reused? Lots of sort of issues around insurance can crop up as well that we need to discuss. But so you get that sort of the establishment of the market, the creation of the physical market, the spatial aspect of that, the data provision, the accessibility to that information, making sure that the quality of that information is accurate. But you also need an infrastructure of knowledge holder and skill holders. So when we have pilot studies on circular procurement, one of the big issues is who has the knowledge of what constitutes circular procurement and is able to undertake a circular procurement contracting and tendering process. And that involves developers, that involves people within the local authority, that involves the investors, it involves the construction workers themselves, who need to understand what role they're playing and how they undertake that role. So there's a huge issue around knowledge and skills. So increasing the amount of secondary materials on the marketplace needs a big investment in education, knowledge and skills across many different sectors. And this is including the local authorities and obviously sort of higher levels of government, but it can't just be people that go and do a master's degree somewhere at a high-end university. We're talking about higher education, professional training for businesses as well. So that's one aspect. Another aspect is that circular procurement is increasingly intertwined with the sort of ideas of ensuring that you have a fair and just transition within a space. So quite a lot of circular procurement strategies are sort of city and urban based, but a lot is also interfaced with promoting social enterprises and promoting small and medium-sized enterprises, so that you're training up and supporting innovative enterprises in a region. And this is a big issue with sort of levelling up, for example, that you want to lock in potential skills training and investment within your region. And again, that's where circular procurement with strategic planning, it has opportunities for local authorities. But I'm saying this on a day when, you know, Birmingham Council is putting up its council tax 10% and is trying to find £600 million of savings. So we're in a real struggle here. We've got the sort of ideal of trying to sell the idea of circular procurement and use of secondary materials, and using tools like pre-redevelopment audits and pre-demolition auditing. But if we don't invest somehow in a broader social agenda, we're going to end up with these only being used in elite buildings that mean that they're very expensive, and we see an old workhouse transformed into a luxury high-end hotel where you have to pay £20 for a cocktail or something. And that's a real issue. And it's a real issue for circularity and circular economy as a whole, that, you know, the need to also plug in that social dimension and employment opportunities for people. So getting more materials on the market isn't just a technical thing. It's not just about gathering data and getting the standards in the ways that Ben's talking about. But these are very important. But it's a broader issue that we need to look at. So we need to also support local authorities with their procurement strategies, understanding of how procurement strategies and circularity within construction can benefit businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, by having a long-term strategy, and the adoption of circular economy strategy that has targets in it in a city or a region, be that urban, peri-urban or county. Having financial incentives, but the financial incentives, a lot of these are not in the control of a local authority, but, you know, such as introducing a virgin raw material tax would be something, but more creative uses of VAT. But local authorities can do things like business rates and make opportunities for pop-up kind of storage centres and business rates for circular circular reconstruction or redevelopment. So there's all these things, but we do have to face the fact that we have an economic climate that well, in some people's eyes it's ideal for moving to circularity, but in other people's it's the reason to not act. We also have institutional vested interests who will be very difficult to turn around. So we do need to focus on having pilots that work and are demonstrable and network with other places, particularly in Europe, but obviously across the borders in Scotland and Wales, where initiatives are also being taking place. And we need to, work with our fellow people in government to identify the appropriate legislative mechanisms, not big glossy stuff, but just small legislative tweaks, which can help stimulate change. And we also, there's a big sort of behavioral dimension to this, that people are reluctant to change. So it takes a lot of effort to change. So yeah, and of course, yeah, I think, because of time, I'm going to stop there. There's lots more to say. We could have a whole thing on circular public procurement. That's maybe in the 3 years' time.
Thank you very much, Ben and Feja both. So we do have some questions in the chat, and there's a question from Lily Tozer. Oh, it's actually not so much a question, more of just that I think you've seen that she'd like to have a conversation about it. And Lily, you've appeared, so that makes me think you do want to have a question.
Rude having my camera off. Just to say thank you very much both. It's hugely helpful presentations, and I think really interesting to see sort of the fact that there is so much potential uncovered through the audits, but then, as you say, you need that enabling framework and to actually encourage what comes next. And I was wondering, Ben, when you made the point around, these audits are not necessarily done at the right time, what do you think would be the right time, and is there something more proactive that should be done?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, to be honest, the answer is just as early as possible, but that's a cop out. I think in terms of pre-redevelopment audits, they're a tricky one. I think because if we're talking, let's say we're talking in the context, we mainly do commercial at the moment, just because, as Feja was alluding to, that's where most of the work is going on. I think it's a pre-redevelopment audit should ideally happen pre-sale, as in pre-exchange of the land asset, and almost be a sort of condition in a sense. Because it will then, it'll then influence what actually happens to that building. If a developer's bought the asset, then they have a pretty clear idea of what they want out of it in terms of returns and that kind of thing. So that makes it trickier. I would also say that pre-redevelopment audits should probably be done or should be reported to a local authority, to the planning authority, rather than to the developer, which I kind of alluded to before. I think, I'll probably leave it there on that. In terms of material audits, they can, in theory, happen at any life cycle stage. If we're talking about a pre-demolition audit, then I would say it's got to be, for it to work properly, it needs to be before the end of concept design, really, thinking about REBA stages, so that the kind of bigger reuse opportunities on site at least can be explored, and then you can start working into the cost program. Thinking about lead-in times, any additional aspects that need to be considered in terms of cost and program. And we see a variety at the moment. Increasingly, it is shifting a bit earlier in the process, so that's positive. But that's with the more ambitious clients, that are actually you know, that are really embedding sustainability. Yeah, business as usual, sort of like stage 3. Yeah, which is yeah. Sorry.
I just want to jump in because there are places where it's placed a mandatory requirement on. Definitely mandatory requirement on pre-demolition audits. So the French Circular Economy Act has that. Then also sort of looking at sort of material audits as part of the sort of move towards digital material passports within construction. So, you know, hooray, Europe's doing that. Sort of looking at that. And obviously the sort of digital product passport is more with sort of new material, new products in construction. But I mean, the huge vested interests and tensions in that whole sort of triangle of like having the pre-development, redevelopment audit before sale, it going to the planning authority within the local authority. I mean, you're probably hitting at the heart of sort of property-based capitalism.
Not going to be popular.
People would go berserk.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, we were having a conversation with an asset manager the other day, sort of investor that invests in properties, and it's a tricky conversation to have at the moment. I think building retention, because a lot of the time it's not going to be as profitable for them. So yeah, it's got to. I don't know whether it is sort of like a carbon pricing type solution, maybe. I honestly don't know, but it's something that needs to be worked out, because yeah, realistically there are a lot of buildings being demolished that are only being demolished because of that rate of return. I think that does need to change, or maybe just a balance of some sort needs to happen. Yeah.
Thank you. Those were good questions and good answers. We've got 2 more questions here. We've got Frozen is first. Frozen, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Thank you, Ben and Feja. So I'm Frozen. I've just recently joined the center as a PhD student from Loughborough University, and I had a question about the role of the stakeholder in pre-redevelopment audits. So pre-demolition audits are usually performed by demolition contractors. So my question was, based on your experience and practicality, who is taking the role of implementing pre-development audits, and who do you think should take on the role in the future?
Yeah, I think it's with pre-demolition audits, demolition contractors do a lot. I think that, you know, with the requirements now, we are seeing more and more kind of private consultants, kind of like us, really, you know, looking at that too. So that's a bit of a mix. Pre-redevelopment audits, again, it's not really established who's actually doing it. The requirements, at least in London, are that it's a third party to the project team. So it's not someone that's directly embedded in the project team. So it's not a contractor or a you know, design team member, or you know, anyone within the project team. So that's really the only requirement. But yeah, at the moment it tends to be consultants. Like quite a few of the big engineering consultants I know are doing pre-redevelopment audits. It's hard to know, to be honest with you. I think there's a few others kind of like us, like smaller scale, that are doing them as well, but yeah, not entirely sure.
Thank you.
Just to come in, I mean, like as Ben said, that most of the sort of activity that they're involved in is in the private sector. One of the issues I was trying to get across was that in the public procurement sector, with the assets, the public assets, the building assets, the portfolio that the responsibility for local authorities is immense. I mean, we're talking hospitals, prisons, town council buildings, schools, and also some of the infrastructure, responsibility for that, you know, roads, and also social housing, some social housing. So incorporating and developing skills for within local authorities to do pre-redevelopment auditing, to make decisions around demolition that are informed is really important. It's absolutely crucial, particularly around the sort of the just transition side, because, you know, like I was just reading about Birmingham, and I mentioned Birmingham. There's 3 tower blocks near a really rundown estate. They get it, the demolition planning permission was given to, but that releases that land, and then for to be sold for housing. So there's lots of socio-economic, environmental issues wrapped up with where the skills along pre-redevelopment auditing is happening, and we really need to be pushing for the skills to be within local authorities, and so that they can address some of the bigger concerns about housing and maintenance of existing public service buildings, I think.
Yeah, it is tricky with I think with the the public sector more so than commercial. We did a project last year called pre-dem, which was looking at implementing pre-demolition audits in local authorities with social housing, and it's really hard because there is if you're arguing, well, we're looking at it in terms of materials and carbon, but there's really big social economic factors there as well at play. So a lot of the time we found some really complex decision-making processes, or I should say, the kind of information that we create in a pre-demolition audit is weighing that up against all these other considerations, these social and economic considerations. It's really hard to say, yes, you should demolish this building, or no, you shouldn't demolish this building, in the sense of from a carbon perspective, let's say, when you could be putting up double the amount of housing there, or improving the quality of housing for a large amount of people. So there are a lot of trade-offs. Yeah, buildings aren't really, they're multi-dimensional, and if there's some way to kind of weigh all of these aspects against each other, that would be great. But there's no kind of universal metric,
Yes.
which is challenging,
Yeah,
and especially
definitely
so in the public sense as well, because you've got to really, get it right.
We don't have that much longer, and we've got, well, in fact, I think we're probably over time. I'm not exactly sure what our time is, but I'm sure it's not more than an hour. But there's Alex who would like to ask a question, so we can hear from him.
Thanks very much. I'll try to be speedy. Thanks both. That was a really good presentation. My question is on the material reuse audit side of things, and I think that everything we're talking about is really valuable. These tools and these strategies, targets, frameworks, etc., that can come in earlier and earlier to try and guide decision making are all hugely beneficial. But I think still, despite having all those things, and even when they're implemented early, we don't actually see very much material reuse happening. Even these materials exchange platforms have thousands of tons of material sat in warehouses or stockyards somewhere, and people just don't want to use them because, from my perspective, largely because they don't have the trust and the confidence in that material that it's applicable for construction. Essentially, there aren't the standards and the warranties available to provide the confidence that people need to pursue reuse, unless, as you mentioned, there's a really invested client who has a close relationship with an architect or a supplier or a materials testing company who can sort of bring everyone in from the start and organize that. So my question is essentially, what do you think that missing link is to bring these tools and frameworks and theories that we have about circular construction into kind of practical reality for more projects, particularly making sure that those projects, as you say, aren't limited to really, really high end, top of the range projects.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Just a bit, because you partly answered your question. Like you need to ensure that there are appropriate warranties, that there are appropriate standards that are accepted by the sector, are accepted by insurers, all of this. And you also need to stimulate demand, and stimulating demand, like by having targets. So with any areas where there's been success, there's been targets. And they also generally have some procurement strategy to stimulate that market. And the targets don't just have to be recycling targets, reuse targets. And, you know, copybook from climate change, you do it over a long period of time, up to 2050, and you stagger it to stimulate that market over a period of time, and then also get people used to, get businesses used to changing their business practice. And that's something that we have to embrace, is like, this isn't going to happen overnight. There has to be a gradual change. But we saw it with climate change, that businesses get on board once they know what the direction of travel, and they tend to invest, and then you get more success than you anticipated. And that's really, I think that's really where we're at, is you need a policy and regulatory support that needs to be way down into the local authorities, like I was saying, as well. And it you know, the tools that Ben's talking about will be fundamental. They'll be like, you know, sort of doing carbon auditing for businesses. This will be another kind of aspect of auditing of materiality in society.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in on the kind of practical sides there with, yeah, you sort of mentioned, you know, warehouses full of materials. I think there is an issue around, or it's a challenge sometimes around warranties and, you know, trust in these materials. But I think what we've seen over the last few years is that those can be overcome. They are being overcome. You know, every few months there's another product or another product type, component type, that someone makes it work, and then you think, oh right, I thought we couldn't reuse that. But it is happening, and we're still kind of in the stage, at least with reuse, where we're figuring it out. But things, you know, steel is a really big success story. You'd kind of think that's one you really, really want to trust because it holds buildings up. And you know, that's been figured out. It's just a matter of actually doing it and getting on and doing it, pretty much. And when you are, you know, when there is increasing attention and you have, like Feja says, targets and requirements around at least looking at circular economy and then achieving certain levels, you know, no matter how low, eventually these kind of things have to get figured out. I mean, on our projects, we are saying to certain clients, you know, even if you're not aiming at getting really high rates of reuse, why don't you target these 2 or 3 trickier to reuse items, and then you're helping the industry knowledge grow a little bit. I think with most things, there's a solution there that we'll probably get to fairly soon. I mean, even concrete, the slabs of concrete, that's been, you know, people have thought, nah, you can't reuse that, but it's being done. There's standards over in Norway, I think,
Switzerland,
for precast. Yeah, what was that, sorry?
I think Switzerland, Norway possibly as well, probably more than one place. Yeah,
exactly. And there's demonstrators coming out, so yeah, we're still finding out about a lot of these things, but it just requires getting on and doing it, pretty much.
Just on the materials stuck in warehouses, again, sort of coordinated strategic procurement can mean that you have a plan, you know where the materials are, where they're going to go. Basically, you bring businesses together, users together, and you work at that. And that sort of portfolio approach has been sort of highlighted in circular public procurement, that what you need is a lot more collaboration and a lot more sharing of innovative ideas between all the actors. So again, that's circular business practice will be different from the practices that we've been used to. And again, that's an issue of changing behaviour, overcoming vested interests, who are doing well out of a system that is bad for all of us.
Okay, thank you. I think this is now 2 o'clock exactly gone, so I think we do need to stop now. It's been, I think, a really interesting presentation and also a very interesting discussion that we